My wife burned my passport to keep me from attending my father's funeral. He's dead. What's he gonna do? Rise and thank you. Not knowing I was set to inherit his $200 million estate. I spent the whole night on the phone. The next morning, she heard a knock that changed everything. I'm Calvin. I'm 52. I've been married to Mira for 23 years. No kids, by choice. We live, or lived, in Seattle, Queen, and area. I've worked in cybersecurity for a tech company most of my life. Myra's a licensed therapist with her own private practice. On the surface, we were the mature couple people looked up to. We traveled once a year, hosted low-key dinner parties, had season passes to the ballet. That's what people saw. Behind the scenes? Different story. Things started cracking around year 18. Mira changed. Or maybe I finally noticed what had always been there. Her resentment, her constant criticism. She'd say things like, "You and that job, you'd marry it if you could." Or, "Why don't you spend half the effort on our life that you spend pleasing your deadbeat family?" That last one cut deep. My relationship with my dad, Ernest, was complicated. He was a giant in the shipping world, started from nothing, ended up building a company worth billions. But he wasn't warm. He was all business. We rarely saw eye to eye. I took a different path: computers, code, strategy. Quiet work. Work that didn't scream. He called it invisible nonsense. When I declined to work for him out of college, he took it personally. We stopped talking for a while. We'd reconnect every few years, always with tension underneath. Still, he was my father. 3 weeks ago, I got a call from his assistant, Bridget. He'd passed away. Massive stroke. He was living in Monte Carlo. The funeral was set for 2 days later. They wanted me there. Myra's reaction? Blank. He's dead. You going there won't change that, she said. And Monte Carlo? Really? What are you gonna do, cry over caviar? I didn't argue. I just quietly booked my flight, packed a small suitcase, and set my passport on the counter. Rookie mistake. The next morning, I couldn't find it. Not in the drawer. Not on the bookshelf. Not in my bag. I turned to Mira. "Hey, have you seen my passport?" She looked up from her phone, completely calm. "Yeah, I burned it. It didn't register at first." I actually laughed. "You're joking." "I'm not." She said it like she was telling me we were out of milk. No apology. No panic. Just ice-cold indifference. "I saved you the trouble. Honestly, I think it's better this way. Let it go. The man's gone." She went out onto the deck, lit a cigarette, and didn't look back at me once. I was frozen. I felt like someone had poured cement into my bones. She had actually destroyed my passport. A federal document. Just to stop me from going. That night, she went to bed early like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep. My heart was racing. My head buzzing. I remembered the USB drive my father had sent a week earlier. Just a small package with no note, no context. I had tossed it in my desk drawer, unopened. I plugged it in. There was a single video file. I clicked play. There he was. My father. Thinner than I remembered. Pale, but still sharp-eyed. "Calvin," he began. "If you're watching this, I've died. And I'm sorry." He paused. Looked off camera. Then continued. "I know we didn't end well. But I've spent the last 10 years preparing something for you. Everything I've built, it's yours. The estate. The company. All of it. But you need to be in Monte Carlo. In person. Within 48 hours of my death." My blood went cold. "If not," he said, "it goes to charity." I sat there staring at the screen. Frozen. I had 18 hours left. I called Bridget. She picked up after 2 rings. I told her everything. My wife, the passport, the video. She was silent for a few seconds. "Do you have any form of ID?" "My old expired passport." "That's something. Let me make some calls." And just like that, the night turned into a flurry of activity. Bridget called in favors. The U.S. consulate in Nice was informed. A diplomat in Seattle was dispatched to get me a temporary passport, but I had to be in New York by the next morning to pick it up at JFK. Every hour was a mad dash. I booked a red-eye, packed another bag in silence, printed everything I could. At 6:30 a.m., there was a knock on the door. 2 men in suits. One American, one French. Mira was still groggy, in her robe, holding coffee. "Mr. Barrett," one said, "we're here to assist you with your expedited travel documentation. You have a 4-hour window." Myra's face? Pure disbelief. "What the hell is this?" she whispered. "You tried to burn the bridge," I said. "But you forgot I know how to build new ones." She tried to argue, to block the doorway. But the consular rep handed her a printed copy of federal penalties for destroying government ID and calmly said, "Please don't obstruct official duties." I walked out without another word. Just grabbed my bag and left. I made it to New York, got the temporary passport, got on a plane to Nice, and landed in Monte Carlo with just under 3 hours to spare. Bridget met me at the airport, almost in tears. "You made it," she said. And that's when everything shifted. I followed Bridget through the marble-floored lobby of the Hotel de Paris, still jet-lagged, dazed, and running on fumes. My heart was racing, not just from the adrenaline of having pulled off a near-impossible journey, but because I hadn't fully accepted what was happening. My father, The man who once called my job invisible nonsense had just left me everything. The funeral was somber but restrained. He'd always said he hated dramatics. A handful of business partners, former colleagues, and estate staff were present. I didn't recognize most of them. The last time I'd seen some of them, I was maybe in my 20s, a reluctant shadow tagging along on international trips. Bridget stayed close. She seemed like more than just an assistant. There was a quiet reverence in the way she moved through every interaction. Everyone knew her, respected her, leaned in when she spoke. It didn't take me long to realize she'd been running the show while Dad got older. After the service, we returned to his estate, an expansive Mediterranean villa nestled into the cliffs overlooking the sea. I'd only seen it in pictures. The scale was overwhelming. Ornate balconies, a stone courtyard, olive trees older than me. I remember standing on the terrace with a glass of water, watching the sun dip behind the sea, and wondering how I ended up there when just 48 hours earlier, I was screaming into my pillow in a Seattle hotel room. That evening, the will was read. I'd been warned about the clause. Still, hearing it aloud made my palms sweat. If Calvin Ernest Barrett is not physically present in Monte Carlo within 48 hours of the decedent's passing, the lawyer read, then the entirety of the estate, personal and corporate assets, shall be transferred to the following charitable foundations. I caught Bridget's glance. And as Mr. Barrett has met the stipulations in person, the assets will be transferred to him over the next 60 days. There was a pause. No applause. No fanfare. Just a heavy silence. $200 million. It wasn't just money. It was shipping lines, port ownerships, warehouses, vessels, trade routes across 4 continents. There was a Geneva property housing half a dozen Impressionist paintings, a penthouse in London, a vineyard in Portugal I didn't even know existed. And I nearly lost it all because Mira didn't think I needed to go. I stayed in Monte Carlo longer than I'd planned. It felt wrong to rush back. Wrong to walk away from the remnants of my father's life without taking time to understand it. I asked Bridget to show me everything. How things worked, what my responsibilities were, what he'd been working on. At first, I expected resentment. She'd been his confidant, clearly trusted. She probably expected to be named heir. But there was none. Instead, she said something I'll never forget. He never stopped watching you, you know. Always reading what you published. Following your patents. He just didn't know how to say he was proud. That hit me harder than anything else. We talked for hours each day about my dad, about the business, about the staff who'd stayed for decades because of loyalty. I got to know a version of him I'd never seen. One built from the memories and stories of people he'd quietly helped, supported, respected. Back in Seattle, Mira had gone silent. At first, I thought she was playing it cool. But then came the texts, voicemails, photos of our dogs, reminders of anniversaries, of our old trips. Her tone moved from confident to confused, then desperate. I didn't answer. I had my attorney send her a letter informing her that I was seeking dissolution of the marriage, that she'd violated multiple legal boundaries, that property and assets were to be separated immediately. She replied with venom, claimed emotional abscess, said I'd abandoned her, that I was throwing away 2 decades over a passport misunderstanding. She didn't know about the video, or the will, or the fact that I'd already signed over the queen and house to her just to get her out of my life as fast as possible. While the lawyers handled the logistics, I kept learning. I visited the vineyards, sat with port supervisors in Naples, listened to long-retired captains tell stories over coffee in Barcelona cafes. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. I just needed to know, to feel connected to something again. My father had been a giant. Flawed, distant, and cold, but still a giant. And beneath that hard exterior, it turned out, was a man who had left a carefully constructed path just for me. A final test of trust, maybe, or redemption. I still hadn't decided what I'd do with it all. Sell it? Keep it running? Live off the interest and disappear? What I knew was that I didn't want to go back to my old life. Seattle felt like a dream I'd already woken from. Mira, once the center of my world, had become a symbol of everything I tolerated instead of chose. I took a slow breath one evening on the cliffs above the sea and said it aloud, just to see how it felt. I'm not going back. It felt right. Bridget had arranged for me to stay at a guest house on the far end of the estate. A smaller villa, if you could even call it that, perched on a quiet stretch of the hillside. It had floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of the Mediterranean that looked like it was pulled from a painting, and enough space to house a family of 5. But it felt empty in a good way. Peaceful. Like the first real silence I'd heard in years. Morning started early. I found myself rising with the sun, walking barefoot across the cold tile floors to make espresso and read reports my father used to review each morning. Shipping forecasts, port schedules, legal updates. I didn't understand half of it at first, but something in me liked the challenge. It reminded me of when I first got into cybersecurity, decoding systems, learning structure from chaos. I met with the legal teams, the financial managers, the board. I expected resistance, skepticism, but most were relieved. Apparently, my father hadn't been the easiest man to deal with toward the end. He'd grown increasingly reclusive, even paranoid. Some suspected he was grappling with the fear of dying alone. Others just chalked it up to him being Ernest Barrett. But none of them questioned my right to be there. The paperwork had been ironclad. He'd made sure of it. Every so often, I'd catch glimpses of who he'd been through the people he left behind, Bridget especially. She had known him better than anyone. They weren't romantically involved, as some had assumed. She told me plainly over dinner one night. He loved me like a sister, like a daughter he never had. I pushed back when others wouldn't. That earned his respect. I believed her. She had a directness that made lies feel out of place. And I trusted her. More than I expected to trust anyone so soon after what Mira had done. Seattle felt like a postcard from someone else's life. I couldn't even picture Mira in the house anymore. The place we called home for 2 decades was now hers alone. And from what my attorney told me, she was milking the sympathy card pretty hard. She had filed a response to the divorce petition full of embellished accusations, neglect, emotional abandonment, whatever that meant in legal terms. None of it stuck. There were no children, no shared businesses, no community property beyond the house, which I signed over just to end it. The part that stung the most wasn't her betrayal. It was realizing how long she had stopped caring. The way she torched my passport wasn't a moment of heated emotion. It was cold, calculated, as though my grief, my roots, meant nothing to her. I tried to look back and pinpoint when it shifted. Maybe it was after my mother passed. Mira didn't come to that funeral either. Said she didn't know her well enough to pretend to be sad. Maybe it was when I started pulling away from social events, or when my job ramped up. She said she wanted connection, but when I made efforts, they were met with silence or sarcasm. I don't need you to fix everything, she once said. Just be here. But whenever I was there, she made sure I felt like I wasn't enough. A therapist married to someone she couldn't even communicate with. There's irony in that somewhere. It took being across the world, standing in the footprint of my father's legacy, to realize how small I'd made myself in that marriage. How much of my identity had shrunk just to keep the peace. And here I was now, being handed keys to an empire I hadn't asked for, but maybe needed. One afternoon, I wandered through the old storage rooms below the estate. That's where I found boxes of journals. My father's journals. Not business logs. Not shipping manifests. Personal journals. Some going back 40 years. I sat on the floor of a dusty wine cellar and read page after page. His early fears when starting the company. His grief after losing my mother. His guilt for pushing me away. Dozens of entries about me. How I never needed approval. How he admired my independence but feared it was a sign I didn't want him in my life. There was even one entry that mentioned Mira, written after the only dinner we ever had together. The year we got married. She's sharp. Calculated. Knows what she wants. I worry she'll harden him. It stopped me cold. I don't know what he saw that I hadn't. But he'd seen something. Something real. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked out to the cliffs around 3 a.m., wrapped in a blanket, the cold air biting my skin, and just stood there. The sea was pitch black. Still, the kind of silence that feels ancient. It was the first time I cried. Not for Mira. Not for the money. For him. For the years we lost. For the words we never said. For the simple act of realizing he had been paying attention all along. Mira never knew that version of him. Never cared to. She saw a man I had distanced myself from and used it as a wedge, as proof that I wasn't capable of connection. But she never asked why I pulled away from him, or what he meant to me beneath the cold exterior. She never understood that even complicated love is still love, and she burned the last bridge to it with a single, cruel decision. A few weeks passed. Time felt slower in Monte Carlo. Days stretched long under the sun, and the nights had a stillness I wasn't used to. Even the air felt different, saltier, older, like it carried secrets. I started developing a routine, something I hadn't had in years that wasn't built around corporate calendars or Myra's schedule. Mornings were spent in meetings or touring facilities connected to the business. Afternoons were quieter, reading, walking, reflecting. I spent hours sifting through my father's journals. I discovered things about him I would have bet money weren't true. He wrote poetry in private. Terrible, clumsy poetry, but he tried. He regretted not being more involved when I was young. He wrote about one Christmas where I stayed in my room the entire day. He had knocked, but I didn't answer. He assumed I hated him. I remembered that Christmas. I had the flu. I just didn't want to infect anyone. That simple miscommunication had left a scar on him that lasted years. And I read about his loneliness. Pages and pages of it. Not just about me, but about my mother, about business partners who turned on him, about Bridget, about growing old surrounded by people who worked for him but didn't know him. It hurt to see how much silence had been exchanged for vulnerability, how we were two men walking around the same landmine, too proud to meet in the middle. The will had triggered a lot of noise in the European business world. A few tabloids had picked up stories. Heir apparent emerges from the shadows. The hidden son of shipping royalty. I kept my head down. My father's legal team advised me to lay low while the inheritance formally transitioned. I didn't mind. I preferred the quiet. Meanwhile, back in Seattle, things were escalating. Mira had started showing up at my old company, trying to make a scene. Claimed she needed access to shared financial accounts, even though the majority were in my name. My assistant, Claire, who had always been polite with her, told her bluntly to leave or security would be called. Mira didn't take rejection well. I hadn't responded to a single one of her texts or calls, but she didn't stop sending them. Screenshots from our early days. Old wedding photos. A video clip from our trip to Santa Fe in 2006 where we danced in the kitchen of the Airbnb to some Spanish folk song we couldn't pronounce. It would have been touching if it didn't feel so manipulative. Then the emails started coming in from mutual friends, some polite, others pointed. Maybe just talk to her. She's hurting. 23 years is a long time to throw away, Calvin. You sure you're not just running away from grief? One message, from a former coworker of mine and Myra's casual friend, stung more than the rest. You know she gave up a lot for you, right? I stared at that line for a long time. Gave up what? She had her career, her house, her freedom. She chose not to have kids. She made that clear early on. And when I brought up the idea of adoption in our mid-30s, after her third miscarriage, she shut it down. Why would I raise someone else's child when I can barely tolerate raising yours? She said. It was said in a heated moment, yes, but it never left me. There was always this quiet venom in the way she could cut deep. She never yelled, never threw things. She just carved you up with a scalpel and left the wounds to fester. Still, I was conflicted. Guilt is a strange thing. Even after someone burns your passport and tries to prevent you from saying goodbye to your father, you still feel bad for walking away. It wasn't just the length of the marriage. It was the investment, the shared history, the identity. Mira had become part of how I introduced myself to the world. She's the grounded one. I'm the techie. She's the people person. I'm the guy behind the screen. But what happens when that story stops being true? When she's not grounded, but controlling? When the people person becomes emotionally unavailable? When you stop being a partner and start being an accessory? I wasn't blind. I knew I checked out in ways too. I buried myself in work. I traveled too much. I stopped asking her about her clients, her dreams, her frustrations. I accepted the cold shoulder instead of challenging it. But the passport, that was the line. That wasn't just marital discord or emotional distance. That was sabotage. It was willful, personal, and cruel. It was her way of saying, I control your access to meaning. And that, I couldn't forgive. Still, I knew eventually I'd have to see her again. We were going to finalize everything in person. There were tax documents, a few signatures, one last meeting. Bridget helped me coordinate the trip. A quiet re-entry into the U.S., an attorney meeting already scheduled. I'd stay in a hotel, not our former home. No dramatics, just closure. I arrived back in Seattle on a gray, damp Wednesday. Classic. Mira had requested we meet in the lawyer's office instead of over Zoom. I said fine. I walked in, bracing myself for a storm. She stood when I entered. Looked older, pale, but her face lit up like she hadn't just tried to sever me from my past. You lost weight, she said. I nodded. You look well. We sat down across from each other, the attorney between us like a referee. The meeting was clinical, efficient, until the lawyer left the room for a moment to retrieve a document. That's when Mira finally spoke. I was scared, she said quietly. When you left. I looked at her, unsure what she meant. Not just scared of losing you. Scared of what that meant about me. About what I became. I didn't reply. I hated him, she said, meaning my father. But I didn't want you to hate me. I still didn't reply. I don't know when I became this version of myself. Cold. Bitter. I watched us drift and thought, if I keep control, I can fix it. But I couldn't. The room felt heavy. Not tense, just full. I finally said, you burned something I can't get back. She nodded slowly. I know. The lawyer returned. We signed what needed signing. She reached out to shake my hand at the end. I took it for a second. It felt like touching the edge of an old life. Recognizable, but not mine anymore. We didn't hug. No tears. Just silence. I left the office, stepped into the drizzle, and walked without a destination for almost an hour. The city felt different. Smaller. I had once shaped my entire world around that place. Around her. Around a life I thought was solid. But it had always been one gust of wind from collapse. I left Seattle the next morning. No drawn-out goodbyes. No sentimental pit stops. I boarded a flight back to Europe with nothing but a carry-on, my laptop, and the file of finalized divorce papers sitting quietly in my email inbox. I didn't look back. Back in Monte Carlo, the sun greeted me like an old friend. I walked into the villa, dropped my bag, opened every window, and let the sea breeze move through the rooms like it had been waiting for me. It felt like I could finally exhale for the first time in years. The formal inheritance process was complete by then. The legal teams handed over full control of my father's company, estate assets, and properties. It wasn't just money, it was infrastructure. Shipping ports, thousands of employees. Legacy. I spent the next few months assembling a leadership team. I wasn't going to micromanage, but I also wasn't going to be a figurehead. I wanted this business to run better than it ever had. I met with each department, learned their problems, their bottlenecks, their wins. Bridget stayed on as my advisor, which turned out to be one of the smartest decisions I made. She knew the ins and outs better than anyone and respected my leadership without ever sugarcoating the hard stuff. We became close, not romantically, but with a trust that ran deep. I needed that. After everything, I didn't have the stomach for anything casual or tangled. Meanwhile, Mira tried to claw her way back in. At first, she played the victim publicly, subtle posts about toxic men, a long-winded blog post about emotional abandonment, and how some people build empires out of other people's grief. She even hinted that I'd manipulated my father into the inheritance. That one made me laugh. But when none of that got traction, she pivoted. Her last-ditch effort was contacting a tabloid. She sold a story about how I left her out of nowhere, became rich overnight, and discarded the woman who stood by me for decades. What she didn't count on was proof. I had texts, emails, voicemails, dates, records of our financials, screenshots of her destroying documents, including a blurry but clearly damning image of my half-burnt passport in our fireplace, pulled from our smart home security footage that she forgot existed. I never intended to use them. But once she went public, I had no choice. My legal team sent a cease and desist and attached the evidence with a warning: retract your statements, or we go to court for defamation. She backed down in under 24 hours. But I wasn't done. I quietly funded a new initiative through the company, the Barrett Fund for Ethical Therapy. It was created to provide oversight and accountability for private practices and therapists engaged in unethical behavior or misuse of influence, especially in emotionally manipulative relationships. We partnered with major psychological associations, universities, and legal teams to offer resources, legal aid, and funding to clients who were victims of unethical therapists. Myra's license was never revoked. I didn't go after her directly, but she knew. Her name wasn't on any website. No one came for her practice. But her clients started asking uncomfortable questions. One even emailed me anonymously months later, thanking me. Said Mira had groomed vulnerability into guilt for years. I smiled when I read it. Not because she suffered, but because the truth had a way of seeping out, like water under a locked door. Revenge didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be clean. I never responded to her again. Not to the birthday email. Not the Christmas card. Not the voicemail where she broke down and said she didn't recognize herself anymore. I believe she meant it. But I also knew it wasn't my responsibility to forgive her so she could move on. Sometimes, the only closure you get is distance. A year later, I stood on the bow of one of our smaller vessels docked in Naples. We'd just launched a new sustainable shipping route, a legacy project in my father's name. Bridget stood beside me with her hands in her coat pockets, smiling at the turnout. "You're not him," she said quietly. "I know. You're better." It didn't feel like a victory lap. It felt like balance had finally returned to my life. Like I'd finally stepped into something that had been waiting for me, not out of entitlement, but because I'd earned it through fire. The inheritance wasn't the real gift. The real gift was learning that peace doesn't come from getting even. It comes from building something stronger than what tried to break you. And sometimes, the most satisfying revenge is living a better life without them in it.